I'll never forget the sound of those hospital machines, the steady beeping that marked each heartbeat, each breath, each moment that my mother had left. She was lying there, pale as the white sheets beneath her, her eyes searching mine for reassurance I couldn't give. In my trembling hand, I held a pen and a document that would change everything, the blood transfusion refusal form. "Are you sure about this, honey?" the nurse asked softly, her voice carrying years of experience with difficult decisions. But before I could answer, Elder Thompson cleared his throat from the corner of the room. "Sister Margaret has made her choice based on biblical principles," he said firmly. "We respect Jehovah's requirements regarding blood." The weight of those words settled over me like a heavy blanket. At 63, I thought I understood faith. I thought I knew what God wanted from me. I'd been raised hearing that accepting blood was betraying God himself, that whoever did so would lose eternal salvation. The elders had taught us since childhood that blood was sacred, that it represented life itself, and that Jehovah would rather see us die faithful than live contaminated. My mother, Helen Martinez, was 78 years old and had been one of Jehovah's Witnesses for over 40 years. She'd raised me in the faith, taken me door-to-door preaching since I could barely walk, taught me to put Kingdom Hall meetings before school events, family gatherings, even friendships. The congregation was our family. The organization was our life. Jehovah was our everything. But lying there on that Tuesday afternoon in St. Mary's Hospital, watching her struggle for every breath, something inside me began to crack. The doctor, Dr. Susan Williams, had explained the situation with clinical clarity that morning. Mom had suffered severe internal bleeding from a perforated ulcer. Her hemoglobin levels had dropped dangerously low. Without an immediate blood transfusion, she would likely die within hours. "There are alternatives," Dr. Williams had said, looking directly at the 3 elders who had arrived shortly after I called the congregation. "But I need to be honest with you. None of them work as quickly or as effectively as blood. Time is not on our side." Elder Thompson, a man in his 70s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had nodded gravely. Elder Rodriguez, younger but equally stern, had opened his Bible to Acts chapter 15. They'd begun quoting verses about abstaining from blood, about how the early Christians preferred death to contamination. I'd heard these arguments my entire life. I'd repeated them to others during our door-to-door ministry. I believed them, or thought I did. But now, with my mother's life hanging in the balance, those verses felt different. Less like divine wisdom, and more like words. Just words on a page. "Margaret," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines. "I trust you to do the right thing." The right thing. What was the right thing? To let the woman who raised me, who taught me to walk and pray and believe, die for a doctrine? Or to save her life and risk losing everything I'd ever believed in? I signed the form. The black ink seemed to spread across the white page like blood itself. Dr. Williams took the document, read it once more, and looked at me with something that might have been pity. "We'll do everything else we can," she said quietly, before leaving the room. The elders shook my hand, told me I'd made a faithful choice, that Jehovah would bless my obedience. Elder Thompson even smiled. "Your mother is fortunate to have a daughter who puts God's requirements first," he said. "This is what true love looks like." As they filed out to give us privacy, I sat beside my mother's bed and held her hand. It was cold, so cold. Outside the window, Phoenix traffic moved at its usual frantic pace. People rushing to jobs, schools, appointments, all the normal concerns of life. None of them facing the choice I'd just made. "Did I do the right thing, Mom?" I whispered. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. "God's way is always right," she murmured, "even when we don't understand it." Those would be among her last words to me. As evening fell, I noticed the gaps between her breaths growing longer. The machines began beeping more urgently. Nurses came and went with increasing frequency. Dr. Williams returned, checked charts, adjusted settings, but I could see the resignation in her eyes. I thought about calling my brother David in California. He'd left the organization 15 years earlier, had been disfellowshipped for questioning doctrine and refusing to return. According to our faith, he was spiritually dead to us. I hadn't spoken to him since 2008, but maybe he deserved to know. Maybe he deserved the chance to say goodbye. I pulled out my phone, then put it away. The elders would ask who I'd called. They'd want to know why I was contacting someone who'd rejected Jehovah's truth. It would reflect poorly on my spirituality, on my loyalty. So I sat there alone with my dying mother, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of the hospital and the weight of 43 years of absolute certainty that was beginning to feel less certain with every labored breath she took. At 11:47 p.m., the machines flatlined. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not peaceful, not serene, just empty. Dr. Williams came in, performed the necessary checks, and officially pronounced what I already knew. My mother was gone. "I'm very sorry for your loss," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "If there's anything you need," I nodded, unable to speak. After she left, I sat alone with Mom's body for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Her face looked peaceful, almost younger. The lines of worry and pain had smoothed away, but all I could think about was the pen in my hand and the signature on that form. Had I just signed my mother's death certificate? Or had I honored God? I honestly didn't know anymore. The funeral was held 3 days later at Kingdom Hall on McDowell Road, the same building where I'd attended meetings twice a week for over 4 decades. The beige walls, the simple wooden podium, the rows of metal chairs, everything looked exactly the same as it had the Sunday before, but somehow it all felt foreign to me now. Brother Henderson, the presiding overseer, gave the memorial talk. He spoke about my mother's faithfulness, her decades of service, her unwavering loyalty to Jehovah's organization. He quoted scriptures about the resurrection hope, about how those who remain faithful unto death receive the crown of life. Sister Helen Martinez chose faithfulness over convenience, he announced to the packed hall. She chose God's way over the world's way. She refused to compromise her beliefs even when faced with death itself. The congregation murmured their approval. Several elderly sisters wiped tears from their eyes and nodded. I sat in the front row, wearing my best black dress, accepting condolences and praise for making the right decision during Mom's final hours. "You were so strong, Sister Margaret," whispered Sister Chen, one of Mom's closest friends in the congregation. "I don't know if I could have been so faithful." "Jehovah gave her the strength she needed," added Sister Rodriguez, patting my shoulder. "What a beautiful witness you gave to those doctors and nurses." A witness. That's what it was called when our faith impressed worldly people, when our behavior made others curious about our beliefs. Apparently, watching my mother die for doctrine was considered a beautiful witness, but inside I felt anything but beautiful. I was Margaret Elena Vasquez, born in 1960 to second-generation witness parents. My father, Roberto, had died of a heart attack in 1995, and my mother had raised me to believe that the organization was God's chosen people on earth, that we alone had the truth, that survival through Armageddon depended on complete obedience to the governing body's direction. I'd never questioned any of it. Why would I? Everyone I knew, everyone I loved, everyone who mattered was part of this world. I'd been baptized at 15, had started pioneering, full-time preaching, at 18. I'd met my husband Carlos at a circuit assembly when I was 22. We'd married 2 years later in a simple Kingdom Hall ceremony. Carlos had been an elder for 12 years before his death from cancer in 2018. Like my mother, he'd refused blood transfusions during treatment. Unlike her, he'd lasted 3 years before the disease finally claimed him. The doctors had said blood products might have extended his life, maybe even saved it, but we'd trusted in Jehovah's wisdom. At least, I thought we had. Now, sitting in that familiar hall, listening to familiar words about familiar promises, I found myself remembering details I'd somehow overlooked before. Like the way Carlos had sometimes stared at the ceiling during his worst nights, whispering questions he thought I couldn't hear. "What if we're wrong?" he'd asked once, around 2 a.m. during his final month. "What if God actually wants us to live?" I told him those were Satan's thoughts, that he needed to pray more, study more, trust more. But now I wondered, what if Carlos had been having the same doubts I was having? After the memorial service, the congregation gathered at Kingdom Hall for the traditional meal. The sisters had prepared all of Mom's favorite dishes: Arroz con pollo, black beans, sweet plantains. People shared memories, told stories about her kindness and generosity, her 43 years of faithful service. "Remember how Sister Helen always brought homemade cookies to the book studies?" laughed Sister Martinez, no relation despite the shared last name. "And how she never missed a meeting, even when she was sick? She was at the hall every Tuesday and Thursday for years," added Brother Stevens, one of the newer elders. "Rain or shine, Helen was there early, staying late to help clean up." It was all true. Mom had been devoted, sacrificial, completely dedicated to the organization. She'd given them her time, her energy, her resources, and ultimately, her life. But listening to these stories, I noticed something troubling. People talked about what Mom had done for the organization, but nobody mentioned what the organization had done for her. When she'd struggled financially after Dad's death, it was her worldly neighbors who'd helped with groceries and utilities. When she'd needed rides to medical appointments, it was my non-witness cousin Linda who'd driven her, not the congregation she'd served so faithfully. The organization was quick to accept sacrifice, but slow to provide support. "Your mother was a pillar in this congregation," Elder Thompson told me as the evening wound down. "I hope you'll continue her legacy of faithfulness." I nodded and smiled, but his words felt heavy. A pillar. That's what devoted witnesses became. Pillars holding up the structure, supporting the weight of everyone else's faith while slowly crumbling under the pressure. That night, alone in Mom's house for the first time, I found myself going through her belongings. Her bedroom dresser was covered with congregation literature. Watchtowers, awakes, meeting workbooks, all carefully marked with her neat handwriting. On her nightstand was a small notebook where she'd recorded her daily Bible reading progress and prayer requests. But tucked away in the back of her jewelry box, I found something unexpected. A letter she'd written, but never sent. It was addressed to her sister Maria, who'd been disfellowshipped 20 years earlier for divorcing an abusive husband. "My dearest Maria," it began. "Not a day passes that I don't think of you and wonder how you are. I miss our conversations, our laughter, the way you used to help me see beauty in simple things. The organization says I can't speak to you, but my heart refuses to forget that you're my sister. I pray that someday we'll be reunited, either in this life or the next. I love you always, Helen." The letter was dated just 3 months before her death. I stared at those words until they blurred through my tears. My mother had missed her disfellowshipped sister for 2 decades, but had been forbidden to express that love. She died without ever sending this letter, without ever breaking the rules, without ever choosing family over doctrine. And I'd helped enforce that separation. I'd supported the decision to shun Aunt Maria. I'd believed it was loving discipline that would motivate her to return. But what if we'd just been cruel? "Jehovah knows what's best," I said aloud, repeating the phrase I'd been taught since childhood. But my voice sounded hollow in the empty house. I picked up the phone to call Elder Thompson, to confess these doubts and ask for spiritual counsel. That's what a faithful witness would do. That's what I'd always done before when questions arose. But instead, I found myself dialing a different number, one I hadn't called in 15 years. "Hello?" The voice was older, rougher, but unmistakably familiar. "David," I whispered. "It's Margaret. Mom is gone." The silence stretched for so long I thought he'd hung up. "How?" he finally asked. "Internal bleeding. She needed blood, but—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "But she refused it." His voice carried no surprise, only sadness. "Of course she did. David, I started to explain, to justify, to defend our decision. But the words wouldn't come. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname he'd called me as a child. "I'm sorry. For Mom, for you, for all of it. When's the funeral?" "It was today. I should have called sooner, but the elders told you I was dead to you. I get it." His voice was gentle, not accusatory. "Are you okay? Really okay?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that my faith was strong, that Jehovah would provide comfort. But sitting there in Mom's house, holding her unsent letter to her shunned sister, surrounded by the remnants of a life lived entirely for an organization that demanded everything and gave little back, I couldn't lie. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know anything anymore." The conversation with David opened something inside me that I'd kept sealed for decades. After we hung up, I sat in Mom's kitchen until sunrise, staring at her collection of Watchtower magazines stacked neatly on the counter. She'd saved every issue for the past 10 years, highlighting important points, making notes in the margins, preparing for the day when the old system would end and these publications would serve as historical proof of God's progressive revelation. But looking at them now, I noticed something I'd never seen before. The dates, the predictions, the subtle changes in doctrine that happened so gradually, most people didn't notice. I pulled out a 1995 Watchtower and compared it to one from 2015. The generation teaching, the explanation of when Armageddon would come, had changed completely. What the organization had called truth in 1995 was now considered old understanding that had been refined by new light. How can truth change? I whispered to the empty room. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research with the same intensity I'd once devoted to field service. I discovered websites I'd been taught to avoid, forums where former witnesses shared their experiences, academic papers examining the organization's history and practices. What I found shattered 43 years of absolute certainty. The blood doctrine itself, the very teaching that had cost my mother her life, had evolved dramatically over the decades. Blood transfusions were once completely forbidden, then certain blood fractions became acceptable, then more fractions, then procedures using the patient's own blood. The organization had created a maze of rules so complex that even elders couldn't navigate them without calling headquarters for guidance. I learned about cases like Moms around the world, thousands of them. Children, parents, grandparents, all dying for a doctrine that kept changing, kept getting refined, kept becoming more nuanced as medical science advanced and legal pressure mounted. Sister Margaret, the voice at my front door, belonged to Sister Patterson, the congregation's secretary. "We haven't seen you at meetings for 3 weeks. The elders are concerned." I opened the door but didn't invite her in. 3 weeks. Had it really been that long since I'd sat in those metal chairs, nodding along to the same repetitive lessons about obedience and loyalty? "I'm still grieving," I told her, which was true, though not in the way she assumed. "Of course you are. Losing your dear mother must be so difficult." Her voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd made many such visits. "But you know what helps grief? Regular meeting attendance, field service, staying close to Jehovah's organization." The word organization hit me like a physical blow. Not God, not Jesus, not faith. Organization, that's what it all came down to. Loyalty to a publishing company in New York that claimed to speak for God. "I need more time," I said. "Well, Elder Thompson asked me to remind you about the circuit assembly next week. Your mother always looked forward to assemblies. I think she'd want you to be there." After she left, I realized something important. They weren't concerned about me. They were concerned about my attendance record. My spirituality was measured not by my character or compassion or relationship with God, but by how often I sat in their buildings listening to their talks. I started paying attention to the language used in meetings and publications. Words like mother organization, spiritual food, light getting brighter, wait on Jehovah. It was specialized vocabulary designed to make members feel special, chosen, different from worldly people. But it was also isolating language that made it harder to communicate with anyone outside the group. The more I studied, the more I recognized the patterns of what psychologists called undue influence, the demand for unquestioning obedience, the discouragement of critical thinking, the punishment of dissent through shunning, the constant reinforcement that the outside world was dangerous and evil. I'd been living in what some experts called a high control group, though we'd never been allowed to use that term. We called it God's organization and believed we were the luckiest people on earth. But if this was God's organization, why did it feel more and more like a prison? One evening, while going through more of Mom's papers, I found her hospital records from a minor surgery she'd had in 2019. The blood refusal form was there, signed in her shaky handwriting. But clipped to it was something that made my heart stop. A note from her doctor expressing concern about her decision and urging her to reconsider. "Mrs. Martinez," the note read, I want you to know that there are witnesses who have accepted blood transfusions and remained in good standing with their congregations. The choice is ultimately yours, but please don't let fear of religious consequences prevent you from accepting life-saving treatment. My mother had known. She'd been told by a medical professional that accepting blood didn't have to mean losing her faith, but she'd been so conditioned to obey, so terrified of disappointing the elders, so convinced that Jehovah would punish any deviation from organizational policy that she'd chosen death anyway. I called David again. I've been doing research, I told him, about the organization, about the blood doctrine, about everything. And I think I've been living a lie my entire life. The silence stretched between us, filled with decades of separation and pain. What are you going to do? He finally asked. I don't know. If I leave, I lose everyone. If I stay, I feel like I'm dying inside. Maggie, can I tell you something? When I was disfellowshipped 15 years ago, I thought my life was over. I'd lost my wife, my kids, my parents, every friend I'd ever had. But you know what I discovered? There's a whole world out here full of good people who accept you for who you are, not what you believe. But what if they're right? What if Armageddon really is coming and only witnesses survive? Then God would be a monster for destroying billions of people just because they weren't members of a specific religious organization. And I don't believe God is a monster. His words echoed in my mind for days. I'd been taught that questioning the organization was questioning God himself. But what if the opposite was true? What if staying silent about harmful teachings was the real betrayal of divine principles? I decided to attend one more meeting to see if anything felt different now that I understood what I was really looking at. The Tuesday night service meeting followed the usual format: a talk about increasing field service hours, a demonstration of how to overcome common objections to our message, an announcement about the new literature campaign. But this time, I noticed things I'd never seen before. The way speakers discouraged higher education because it promoted independent thinking. The subtle threats about what happened to people who left the organization. The constant emphasis on obedience to human leaders who claimed divine authority. During the closing song, I looked around at faces I'd known for decades. Sister Chen, who'd given up a nursing career to pioneer. Brother Martinez, who'd declared bankruptcy rather than miss meetings for a second job. Sister Thompson, whose son had committed suicide after being disfellowshipped for homosexuality, and who still defended the organization's stance on LGBTQ issues. These weren't bad people. They were trapped people. Kind, sincere, devoted people who'd surrendered their critical thinking abilities to a group that claimed to have all the answers, just like I had been. After the meeting, Elder Rodriguez approached me. Sister Margaret, we need to schedule a shepherding call. There are some concerns about your spiritual progress since your mother's death. What kind of concerns? I asked, though I already knew. Well, your meeting attendance has been irregular. Sister Patterson mentioned some troubling comments you made, and frankly, your attitude tonight seemed distant. Distant. That was the word they used when someone wasn't displaying proper enthusiasm for organizational activities. I'm still processing my grief, I said carefully. Of course, but grief can make us vulnerable to Satan's influence. That's why it's so important to stay close to the congregation and accept help from the elders. Help. What they called help, I was beginning to recognize as surveillance. I'll think about it, I told him. As I drove home, I realized this was the moment, the choice point. I could schedule that shepherding call, confess my doubts, submit to their spiritual guidance, and try to suppress everything I'd learned. Many people did exactly that. They lived double lives, publicly conforming while privately questioning, staying for family or community or simple fear of change. Or I could be honest about what I'd discovered and face the consequences. The consequences would be severe. Disfellowshipping meant complete social death. Every witness I'd ever known would be required to treat me as if I didn't exist. No greetings, no conversations, no acknowledgement of my humanity. My mother's friends would cross the street to avoid me. The community that had defined my entire life would become instantly hostile. But staying meant continuing to pretend that an organization was God's voice on earth. It meant supporting teachings that had killed my mother and countless others. It meant living a lie. That night, I sat at my computer and began typing. Not a letter to the elders requesting a shepherding call. Something else entirely. I started writing my story. I wrote about signing that blood refusal form while my mother died. I wrote about discovering the unsent letter to her shunned sister. I wrote about the research I'd done, the changes in doctrine, the patterns of control I'd finally learned to recognize. Most importantly, I wrote about the choice every witness faces but rarely acknowledges: loyalty to an organization or loyalty to conscience. I wrote until dawn, pouring 43 years of suppressed questions onto the screen. And when I finished, I realized I'd made my decision. I was going to tell the truth, all of it, no matter what it cost me. The only question left was how. The shepherding call was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. Elder Thompson and Elder Rodriguez would be coming to my house for what they called spiritual encouragement. But what I now understood was an interrogation designed to assess my loyalty to the organization. I spent the day preparing, but not in the way they expected. Instead of reviewing Watchtower publications or preparing humble explanations for my recent absence, I printed out documentation of everything I'd discovered: the changes in blood doctrine over the decades, academic studies on undue influence in high-control groups, medical journals discussing unnecessary deaths from blood refusal, and most importantly, Mom's unsent letter to Aunt Maria. At exactly 7 o'clock, their car pulled into my driveway. Through the window, I watched Elder Thompson adjusting his tie and Elder Rodriguez carrying his leather Bible case. These men had been part of my life for years. I'd trusted them, respected them, believed they spoke for God himself. Now I saw them differently. Sister Margaret, Elder Thompson smiled as I opened the door. Thank you for making time for us. We know this is a difficult period. They settled into Mom's living room, the same room where we'd held countless family worship nights and book studies. Elder Rodriguez opened his Bible to a passage about comfort during mourning. Elder Thompson pulled out a notebook where he'd apparently written discussion points. We wanted to check on your spiritual well-being, Elder Thompson began. Losing your mother was a tremendous test of faith. How are you coping? This was my moment. I could still back down. I could play the grieving daughter, accept their counsel, return to regular meeting attendance, and pretend nothing had changed. It would be easier, safer, less painful. Instead, I reached for the stack of papers I'd prepared. Actually, I've been doing a lot of research since Mom died, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have some questions about our teachings. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Elder Rodriguez closed his Bible. Elder Thompson's smile became more cautious. What kind of research? Elder Thompson asked. I've been studying the history of our blood doctrine. Did you know that in 1945, the organization taught that vaccinations were forbidden because they were an injection of animal matter into the human body? Then, in 1952, they reversed that position. Same with organ transplants, forbidden in 1967, allowed again in 1980. The light gets brighter, Elder Rodriguez said automatically. Our understanding becomes clearer over time. But people died following those earlier teachings, I continued. Children died because their parents refused vaccines that the organization later said were acceptable. Patients died refusing organ transplants that were later considered matters of conscience. How do we explain that? Elder Thompson leaned forward. Sister Margaret, it sounds like you've been reading apostate literature. You know that's dangerous to your spirituality. I've been reading medical journals and historical documents. Are facts apostate if they're inconvenient? The source matters, Elder Rodriguez interjected. Satan can use truth to promote lies. He can twist facts to undermine faith. I pulled out Mom's hospital records, including the note from her doctor about witnesses who had accepted blood and remained in good standing. Mom's doctor told her that some witnesses accept blood transfusions without losing their faith, but she was too afraid to even consider it. She died because she was terrified of disappointing you, of disappointing the organization. Both elders examined the document carefully. Elder Thompson's expression grew more serious. Sister Margaret, your mother made a faithful choice based on Bible principles. She'll be resurrected because of her loyalty to Jehovah. Will she? I asked. Because I've also learned that our resurrection teaching has changed multiple times. We used to teach that only 144,000 would go to heaven and everyone else would be annihilated. Then we added the earthly resurrection. Then we changed who qualifies. How do we know our current understanding is correct? You're asking dangerous questions, Elder Rodriguez said, his voice taking on a warning tone. Questions that could shipwreck your faith, or questions that could lead to truth, I replied. Isn't that what we claim to want? Truth? I reached for Mom's unsent letter and handed it to Elder Thompson. This is a letter my mother wrote to her disfellowshipped sister but never sent. She died missing her sister, loving her sister, but forbidden to express that love because of organizational policy. How is that different from the Pharisees who put their traditions above mercy? Elder Thompson read the letter silently, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he set it down carefully. Sister Margaret, I can see that grief has made you vulnerable to Satan's influence. These doubts you're expressing are exactly what he wants. Division, questioning of God's organization, rebellion against theocratic order. What if they're not Satan's influence? I asked. What if they're just human decency, human compassion, the ability to think for myself that God gave me? God gave you a mind, Elder Rodriguez said firmly, but he also gave you his organization to guide that mind. Individual thinking leads to apostasy. There it was. The core belief that had controlled my entire life. Don't think for yourself. Don't trust your own moral judgment. Don't question. Don't research. Don't doubt. Just obey. I can't do that anymore, I said quietly. I can't pretend that watching my mother die for a doctrine that keeps changing was beautiful or faithful or right. I can't pretend that shunning people for asking questions is love. I can't pretend that an organization in New York speaks for God. The silence that followed was deafening. Elder Thompson closed his notebook. Elder Rodriguez stared at me with something that looked like genuine sadness. Sister Margaret, Elder Thompson said slowly, do you realize what you're saying? You're questioning the faithful and discreet slave. You're rejecting God's appointed channel of communication. I'm questioning men who claim to speak for God, but whose teachings keep changing, whose policies cause unnecessary suffering, whose definition of love includes shunning, and whose definition of truth includes forbidding research. Then you're an apostate, Elder Rodriguez said, the word falling like a death sentence. If asking questions makes me an apostate, then I'm an apostate, I replied. If wanting to save lives instead of sacrificing them to doctrine makes me an apostate, then I'm an apostate. If choosing love over legalism makes me an apostate, then yes, I'm an apostate. Both men stood simultaneously, as if they'd choreographed the movement. We'll be scheduling a judicial committee, Elder Thompson said, his voice now completely formal. You'll receive notice of the time and date. We strongly recommend that you use the time between now and then to pray, study, and repent of these dangerous thoughts. And if I don't repent, then you'll be disfellowshipped for apostasy, and we'll announce to the congregation that you're no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. They gathered their things and moved toward the door. At the threshold, Elder Rodriguez turned back. Margaret, I've known you since you were a child. Your parents would be heartbroken to see what you've become. My parents are dead, I said. They died following teachings that may have been wrong, and I refused to follow those same teachings to my own spiritual death. After they left, I sat alone in Mom's living room for a long time. The house felt different now. Not like a refuge, but like a museum of a life I was no longer living. Tomorrow, word would spread through the congregation. People would start avoiding me. Phone calls would stop. Invitations would disappear. I was about to lose every friend I'd ever had, every social connection I'd ever made, every sense of community and belonging I'd ever known. But for the first time in 43 years, I felt free. The Judicial Committee was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7:30 in the evening. I received the official notification on Friday, a formal letter stating that I was being called before 3 elders to answer charges of apostasy. The tone was cold, bureaucratic, like a summons to court rather than an invitation to spiritual guidance. I had 5 days to prepare, 5 days that felt like a countdown to the end of my world. Word had already begun to spread through the congregation. Sister Patterson stopped returning my calls. When I encountered Brother Martinez at the grocery store on Saturday morning, he looked directly through me as if I were invisible. The invisible treatment, that's what they called it, when someone was suspected of apostasy but not yet officially disfellowshipped. I was getting a preview of my future. Sunday morning arrived without the familiar routine of preparing for the meeting. For 43 years, I'd spent Sunday mornings ironing my best dress, reviewing the Watchtower study article, preparing comments to participate in the discussion. Now I sat in Mom's kitchen in my pajamas, drinking coffee and feeling utterly lost. The silence was overwhelming. No kingdom songs playing in the background. No hurried gathering of Bible and publications. No careful application of modest makeup and conservative jewelry. Just silence and the strange freedom of a Sunday morning with nowhere to go. I called David. "How are you holding up?" he asked when he heard my voice. "They've scheduled a judicial committee for Tuesday. After that, it'll be official. Are you going to attend?" I'd been wrestling with that question for days. Attending meant subjecting myself to interrogation by men who'd already decided my fate. It meant sitting in a windowless room at the Kingdom Hall while 3 elders questioned my loyalty, my faith, my right to think for myself. But not attending meant they'd proceed without me, making their decision based on second-hand reports and assumptions. "I think I have to," I said. "I need to say what I need to say, even if they're not listening." "What will you tell them?" "The truth. All of it. Maggie, are you sure you're ready for what comes after? Once they disfellowship you, there's no going back. Every witness you've ever known will treat you like you're dead." I know. And I did know, intellectually. But knowing something in your mind and experiencing it emotionally are completely different things. Monday passed in a strange, suspended state. I found myself doing ordinary things: laundry, grocery shopping, paying bills, while knowing that after tomorrow, my entire social universe would collapse. It felt like being diagnosed with a terminal illness. Life continues normally until it doesn't. That evening, I sat down and wrote letters I would never send. To Sister Chen, explaining why our friendship meant so much to me and why I hoped she'd one day understand my choice. To Brother Stevens, thanking him for his kindness during Mom's funeral, and asking him to consider whether an organization that demands absolute obedience might not be what Jesus had in mind. To my cousin Linda, the non-witness who'd always been there when the congregation wasn't, telling her she was about to become my only family. Tuesday arrived gray and rainy, which felt appropriate. I spent the day writing, not letters this time, but my story. The complete account of everything that had led me to this moment. Mom's death, the research I'd done, the pattern of control I'd finally recognized, the choice between organizational loyalty and personal conscience. I wrote about the blood doctrine that had killed my mother and thousands of others. I wrote about the shunning policy that destroyed families. I wrote about the discouragement of education and critical thinking. I wrote about the claim to be God's only channel of communication on earth. As 6 o'clock approached, I realized I wasn't going to the judicial committee, not because I was afraid, though I was terrified, not because I hoped to avoid disfellowshipping, because that was inevitable now, but because attending would validate a process I no longer believed had any moral authority. 3 men in suits did not speak for God. Their interpretation of ancient texts did not constitute divine law. Their authority existed only because people like me had granted it to them, and I was withdrawing that grant. Instead of driving to Kingdom Hall, I drove to Mom's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the evening light. Her headstone was simple. Helen Martinez, beloved mother and faithful servant of Jehovah, 1945-2023. The inscription had been Elder Thompson's suggestion, approved by the congregation's body of elders. I knelt beside the grave and pulled out the letter she'd never sent to Aunt Maria. "Mom," I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to speak. "I found your letter. I know you missed Maria. I know you loved her even when you weren't allowed to show it." The words came easier then. I told her about my research, about my doubts, about the choice I was making. I told her I understood why she'd refused the blood transfusion, why she'd died rather than risk disappointing the elders. I told her I forgave her for teaching me to fear questions and doubt my own judgment, and I told her I was choosing differently. "I'm going to contact Aunt Maria," I said. "I'm going to tell her about your letter. I'm going to tell her you never stopped loving her." As I spoke, my phone buzzed with a text message from Elder Thompson. "Sister Margaret, The committee is waiting for you. Please call immediately to explain your absence." I turned off the phone. The next morning, I woke to find a voicemail from Elder Rodriguez. "Margaret, your failure to appear before the Judicial Committee last night was deeply disappointing. The committee has made its decision based on your previous statements and your refusal to cooperate with the process. An announcement will be made at Thursday's meeting." Thursday. 2 days to prepare for social death. I spent Wednesday putting my affairs in order like someone preparing for major surgery. I called my bank, my insurance company, my employer, anyone who might need to reach me in an emergency, and gave them David's number as an emergency contact since my congregation contacts would no longer be available. I also did something I'd been putting off for 20 years. I looked up Aunt Maria's phone number. She was living in Tucson, about 2 hours south of Phoenix. The online directory showed Maria Santos at an address in a quiet residential neighborhood. My mother's sister, the woman who'd been declared spiritually dead for divorcing an abusive husband, was alive and apparently thriving. I dialed her number with shaking hands. "Hello?" Her voice was older, but still carried the warmth I remembered from childhood. "Aunt Maria? This is Margaret, Helen's daughter." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Margaret?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is everything okay? Is Helen—" "Mom passed away 3 weeks ago. But that's not why I'm calling." I told her about the letter. I read it to her over the phone, word by word, while she cried softly on the other end. "She wrote that?" Maria asked when I finished. "She really wrote that? She missed you every day. She loved you every day. She just wasn't allowed to tell you. I've been hoping for 20 years that she'd call. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I got sick or scared, I wanted to hear my sister's voice. But I understood why she couldn't. She wanted to. She just couldn't break the rules. And you can." I thought about that question as Thursday evening approached. Could I break the rules? Could I survive the consequences? Could I build a new life after losing everything I'd ever known? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. At exactly 8 o'clock Thursday evening, while the congregation was gathered for their weekly meeting, while Elder Thompson was standing at the podium making his announcement about my disfellowshipping, I posted my story online. I titled it, "The Signature That Changed Everything, A Mother's Death and a Daughter's Awakening," and I hit publish. The story went viral within hours. I woke Friday morning to hundreds of comments, thousands of shares, and dozens of private messages from people around the world who'd had similar experiences. Former Jehovah's Witnesses shared their own stories of losing family members to the blood doctrine. Current witnesses wrote anonymously about their secret doubts. Healthcare workers described the frustration of watching patients die from preventable causes. But it was the message from Dr. Susan Williams, the physician who'd treated my mother, that moved me most. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "I remember you and your mother vividly. I've treated dozens of witness patients over the years, and your mother's case has haunted me. Thank you for having the courage to speak out. Your story might save lives." The response wasn't entirely positive, of course. I received angry messages from witnesses defending the organization, accusing me of apostasy, warning me about God's judgment. Some threatened to report me to local elders, apparently not realizing I'd already been disfellowshipped. A few were genuinely hateful, calling me names I won't repeat. But for every angry response, there were 10 messages of support and gratitude. "Your story helped me understand why my brother died," wrote a woman from Canada. "Thank you for helping me grieve properly." "I'm still a witness, but your article made me think," wrote someone from Germany. "Maybe thinking isn't as dangerous as they say it is." "I left the organization 10 years ago and felt so alone," wrote a man from Australia. "Reading your story made me realize I wasn't crazy for questioning." Within a week, my phone was ringing constantly. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell my story. Podcasters invited me to discuss religious trauma and recovery. Support groups for former witnesses asked me to speak at their meetings. I accepted some invitations and declined others. I wasn't interested in becoming a professional ex-witness or building a career on attacking the organization, but I was passionate about helping people understand the difference between healthy faith and harmful control. 3 months after my disfellowshipping, I received an unexpected visitor. Sister Chen stood at my front door, looking nervous and glancing around as if she feared being watched. "I'm not supposed to be here," she said without preamble, "but I read your story online." I invited her in, offered coffee, waited for her to explain. "My daughter Sarah has been asking questions," she said finally, "about college, about marriage outside the organization, about whether God really requires all the meetings and field service. The elders told me to shut down her questions, to focus on obedience instead of understanding." She paused, staring into her coffee cup. "But your story made me wonder. What if Sarah's questions aren't from Satan? What if they're from Sarah?" We talked for 2 hours. I shared resources about healthy versus unhealthy religious practices, about the difference between faith and control, about raising children to think rather than simply obey. When she left, Sister Chen hugged me, a violation of the shunning rules that could get her disfellowshipped if anyone reported it. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me remember that my daughter matters more than the organization's approval." 6 months later, Sarah Chen enrolled in college to study psychology. Sister Chen and her husband quietly stopped attending meetings. They weren't formally disfellowshipped, but they'd mentally and emotionally left the organization. Sarah calls me occasionally to thank me for the conversation that helped her mother see things differently. That's when I truly understood the impact of speaking out. It wasn't about destroying people's faith or convincing everyone to leave their religion. It was about giving people permission to think, to question, to choose love over fear, family over doctrine, conscience over compliance. A year after Mom's death, I drove to Tucson to meet Aunt Maria in person. She was 75, gray-haired, and walked with a slight limp from an old injury, but her eyes still sparkled with the mischief I remembered from childhood visits. We spent the weekend looking through old photo albums, sharing memories of Mom, talking about the 20 years of separation that should never have happened. Maria had built a good life. She'd remarried a kind man named Robert, had stepchildren and grandchildren who adored her, had volunteered at a local animal shelter for 15 years. "I never stopped hoping Helen would call," she told me, as we sat on her back patio watching the sunset over the desert mountains. "But I also never stopped living. That's what you have to do when people you love are trapped in systems that don't allow love." "Do you think she's at peace now?" I asked. Maria considered the question seriously. "I think your mother was at peace when she died, because she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. And I think she's at peace now because love doesn't end with death, and neither does understanding. Maybe in whatever comes after this life, she sees things more clearly." I liked that answer. It honored Mom's sincere faith while acknowledging the tragedy of her unnecessary death. 2 years after going public with my story, I married Robert Chen. No relation to Sister Chen, despite the shared surname. Robert was a retired teacher who'd never been a witness, never understood religious control until he met me, but who loved me enough to learn about religious trauma and support my healing journey. Our wedding was small and joyful, attended by my chosen family of former witnesses, supportive relatives like Aunt Maria, and new friends who accepted me exactly as I was. David walked me down the aisle, making up for all the family events we'd missed during his 15 years of shunning. Today, 3 years after Mom's death, I work part-time as a consultant, helping healthcare facilities understand religious refusal cases and supporting families facing similar situations. I've testified before medical ethics committees about the blood doctrine's impact on patient care. I speak at conferences about religious trauma and recovery. But mostly, I live a quiet life focused on the things that matter most. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than shared doctrine. Love expressed through acceptance rather than control. Faith grounded in compassion rather than fear. I still believe in God, though my understanding of divine love looks nothing like what I was taught as a witness. I believe in the power of truth to heal and transform, in the importance of asking difficult questions, in the sacred responsibility to protect vulnerable people from harmful teachings. Every morning, I wake up grateful for the choice I made in that hospital room. Not the choice to sign the blood refusal form, but the choice to question what came after. The choice to research, to think, to trust my own moral judgment, to speak truth even when it cost me everything I thought I valued. Mom's death wasn't in vain if it leads to other families making different choices. Her love wasn't wasted if it inspires people to choose love over legalism, mercy over doctrine, life over death. Last month, I received a message from a young mother in Brazil whose premature baby needed a blood transfusion. She'd read my story translated into Portuguese and decided to authorize the treatment despite pressure from her congregation. The baby survived and is now thriving. "Your mother's story saved my daughter's life," she wrote. "Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth." Standing at Mom's grave on the 3rd anniversary of her death, I read that message aloud. The spring air was warm, carrying the scent of desert wildflowers and the sound of children playing in a nearby park. Life continuing, love persisting, hope growing despite loss and pain. "She's alive, Mom," I whispered to the headstone. "That little girl in Brazil is alive because your story is changing hearts and saving lives. Your death wasn't meaningless. Your love wasn't wasted." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers I'd brought. Not the formal arrangements the congregation would have chosen, but wild flowers like the ones she used to pick on our family walks before meetings became more important than moments. As I drove home to Robert and our quiet dinner plans, I realized that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means transforming pain into purpose, loss into love, silence into story. And sometimes, if we're very brave and very blessed, our stories become bridges that help others find their way home to themselves. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with your experience. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.